All right, welcome back everybody. Rufi here for another video for ValueHeavy coaching. Sorry for the delay since the last video. I've talked in the Discord that I'm gonna do another video about facing river pro bets and what to do against them, which hands to bluff catch, which hands to bluff raise. Took me a while because I had some stuff going on. And also, to be fair, this spot is quite a bit more nuanced than some other spots. Definitely also more complicated than the turn probing spot. So I had to also, wanted to look into it a bit more myself, learned quite a bit before by making this video. And yeah, just wanted to make sure that I can give you guys the best output after looking through all the things that you have to take in consideration in this spot. So we'll be looking today for spots where we see that, small on the flop, it goes check check on the turn, and then we face a bet on the river, mainly focusing on the block bet sizing, but also looking a bit into the larger sizing towards the end of the video. Of course, there's a tons of spots how this could go, right? You could use different sizes on the flop. They could use a different size on the river, so there's already a couple of more options on how this goes. And of course, if you train this spot, sometimes the solver is not going to use a small size on the flop, only a large size, and this is going to affect the output. Or sometimes the opponents are only going to use a large size, or only going to use a small size. And if you train for different sizes with the solver, then this might not end out well. But I think by using the small bets, you get a general to find general heuristics, trying to find hands, which hands make for good calls, which hands make for good bluff raises. Even though the solver might not always um, yeah, that we have given them. And first I thought I'm gonna do it similar to last time, where I'm just gonna look at a trade and we go through some hands. But I thought it's a bit better to just take out a couple of boards, show some key examples, show what to look at, what to think about in each different spot, and then I'll just give you the trainer so you train yourself, post some hands in the Discord, and we can discuss different spots because there's tons of different runouts, tons of different sizes. So it's a very, very interesting spot, but definitely one that I think most people haven't really studied at all, or very poorly. So definitely think it's gonna give you an edge once you've mastered the other common spots in the game tree, and definitely one where you can making quite a bit of money on the tables. All right, so let's get into it. Um, this board here is the first board. It's always going to be button versus big blind, using a small c bet on the flop, check check on the turn, and then we see the small bet from out of position on the river. Um, what I When I want to look at the spot, and be in position, I first want to think about, okay, what are villains versus value bet's gonna be for the sizing, or which type of hand class is he gonna be betting with for value when he uses this block bet sizing. And as we can see on a board like this, right, obviously it's gonna be like his strongest second pair, something like ace jack, queen jack. Those are basically pure block betting, and then some of the jack 9, jack 8, and then he mixes in some of the stronger or some top pair hands as well, like king queen, or king 4, king 3, and then just random bluffs a bit here and there. And then I also want to think about what are going to be his automatic bluffs that he's going to be using on this note. That's going to be his queen x hands, as we can see, right? All the queen x hands that he called on a flop that now kind of have to bluff, and all of his flush draws, right? Like if he has like a hand like 8-6 with the flush draw, 7-4 with the flush draw, 7-6, right? Everything that doesn't have a pair on the river kind of has to bluff. So those are going to be his automatic bluffs. And then the third point I want to be thinking about in every spot is this a good spot to bluff catch in general? Because there's a lot of mistrust. Then I want to be bluff catching, but then it's also automatically a good spot to be bluff raising, because when I bluff raise on the river, it's not just about making him fold or making him fold a hand like Jack 8, right? We also want to think about the automatic hands that he's going to be folding, such as his missed flush draws or his queen high hands. So if a spot is generally good to be bluff catching, then a spot is also going to be good to bluff raise on the river for the imposition player. Knowing that, we can now look on the river and kind of see which hands make good bluff catches and which hands make good bluff raises on the river. Okay. So first of all, we're gonna have our automatic calls, right? Like if we have hands that beat value bets, we have automatic calls. That's why it's so important to establish which hands he's value betting. Just try and guess the right threshold. As we can see, obviously we're never folding top pair, but we're also never folding second pair hands because those just beat bluffs, right? Like ace jack, as we saw, he's value betting worse for value, so we have an automatic call. And then even a hand like Jack 8 or Jack 7, Jack 6 that might not beat value bets because his threshold is Jack 9. They are still bluff catching just because we block some of his value hands, so they just make for plus EV calls. Where it gets more interesting are then the third pairs, the low pairs, and the ace highs, because those hands are just beating bluffs, but not they're not beating value. So here we can see that there is a mix between fold, call, and raise. Now, when we just think about his blockers, we know that he is bluffing his missed flush draws. So like spades are bluffing. So having the ace of spades or the eight of spades is pretty bad card to be having because we block his bluffs. We don't really want to call those hands. And the same goes for the backdoor flush draw, right? Like he could call a hand like ace 3, ace 4 of hearts, ace 5 of hearts on the flop with the gut shot. And we don't really want to have those hands because they block his automatic bluffs. What we can see, however, both with the off-suited and the suited variation here, that having ace-8 of hearts or ace-8 of clubs would in theory be a decent bluff catch because we don't really block hands that he will be bluffing with. We beat all his bluffs, so we have good unblockers to his bluffs. We beat his bluffs. We have a pretty decent bluff catcher. Right, so once we get to the point, I'm sure many of you are aware of this. It's more important about blockers and unblockers. When we're just bluff catching, we don't really care about absolute strength, right? A hand like eights is not necessarily better than an ace 8 because both only beat bluffs, and we just then want to think about the blockers. And you can see here, indeed, eights and sevens are folding, especially when they do have the spade in the hand. They just pure folding because they just block bluffs and they don't really have good blocker properties. Now, I talked about the last point is when we think about bluff catching or bluff raising, would this be a good spot to bluff catch or bluff raise? Yes or no? And for that we can have to go back to the big blind again and look at this very nice filter, and this is like the no-mate hands. Does he, if he gets to the river, is he allowed to bluff every hand that doesn't have any showdown value? Yes or no? In this case, he is allowed, and he should be bluffing every hand that has 0 showdown value, right? Every no-mate hand he gets to the river with, he should be bluffing. So this indicates that it's very natural to, it's natural to bluff these hands that have no showdown value. But if somebody's a bit nittier and might give up with missed spades sometimes and is afraid to bluff those, then that might be a bad case. He's even allowed to bluff some of his ace high hands, the ace high missed flush draws and backdoor flush draws, right? Ace 4, ace 3, ace 6. It only really has to give up his like the worst flush draws that he has. So this is a spot that where he has to bluff a lot, and therefore it's probably a bit under bluffed, right? Because the value bets are always easy to find, but it's hard to find the bluffs with random hands. And this is, given how wet this texture was and giving a pretty bricky runner that didn't really change anything. If we change this to the 5 of spades, obviously this he gets to bluff way more. If we look now, more draws completed. He gets to bluff almost every ace high now. He even gets to start bluffing some of the low pairs, sevens, sixes, nines if he called them. Even right? Even queen 5 gets the bluff here sometimes. So this is really a spot that's poor to both bluff catch and bluff raise, and you have to be quite careful here because yeah, he's really hard for him to have any bluffs. So yeah, we don't want to do much calling or raising in a spot like this. But we can still learn quite a bit of which hands are good bluff catches here in theory to learn heuristics and which hands make for good bluff raises. So first of all, given now that we know which are good bluff catches and which are bad bluff catches, we know that we don't want to have spades in our hand. We also don't want to have hearts in our hand. We'd rather have diamonds or clubs in our hands, which we can see, as we said, with the ace-8, with the a7 that do bluff catch sometimes. We know that we call every jack because they're simply strong enough because he's value betting those hands. Now, when we go one step further and we think about, okay, now we know what our bluff catches are, what do we want to bluff raise? It gets a bit more complicated and gets a bit more tricky. And there's different things that we want to think about when it comes to how often do we raise, which hands do we use as a raise, and you know, what blockers do we have, or which frequency do we want to raise. So first of all, we want to, you know, obviously raise more if we face a small size from out of position, like in this situation. Obviously, we raise more if we face a block bet than when we face an overbet. I think that's pretty common sense. And then we would also raise more. On this board, it doesn't really apply, but you know, let's say it's a low board and then the king or an ace comes and overcard comes in river. That gives us new top pair. That gives us new strong hands. That's also going to be a card where we can rep a lot of rep strong hands that also make sense to raise. So we therefore also want to have bluff raises. And the same goes for when like a flush completes because we're gonna be checking back flush draws and then we can raise them for value on the river. And when the run out breaks out, like in this case, we have to be a bit more careful with what we are gonna raise because we're kind of saying we did check back a decent hand on the turn, like a top pair or maybe a weak two pair. And we're gonna, or maybe a trap, and that we're gonna raise now. Especially on a board like this draw heavy, right? We're not really gonna check back straight like ace queen or queen nine because those hands are just too strong. They just want to get in the money. They don't want to check in a trap. Hands that are more likely, so you can see that we check back, are mainly here top pairs that we have that we check back, right? Like these weaker top pairs, some stronger top pairs, sometimes as traps, and then we're gonna have some two pairs, right? And either weaker ones like Jack 10, but also very often ones that we river with like the King 5 or the Jack 5 that were one pair hands on the turn. And this knowing what we want to value raise is also going to help us to know first which hands we are going to pick, but also which sizing we're going to use. So when we think about, okay, what do we want to rep? Let's say the board bricks out or an overcard comes, right? We're mainly repping a top pair that we checked behind or a weak two pair that we rivered. So we want to reuse something in medium sizing, something between, as we can see here, between 40 and 80%. You know, you can go 66% and then simplify it to one sizing. And if a draw completes, if a straight comes in, if a flush comes in, and we want to represent those hands, we obviously use a larger sizing because those hands are stronger. We have fewer of those hands in our range, so we use maybe like a pot size or a slight overbet to raise when we represent a flush or a straight. Okay, and then for this, we then also gonna think about our blockers, and you know, on especially on a board like this one where it breaks out, it's maybe not that obvious which are good blockers. And when we think about blockers or which hands we want to bluff raise, we obviously would like to, if their draws completed, we would like to block those complete draws, right? We always want to block the value if the flush comes in, if the straight completes. Blocking those is generally a good thing. But it's also really important to unblock the missed bluffs that our opponent has, right? As we talked about before, we want to not block his bluffs, right? So we get the automatic folds from the bluffs that he's going to have, because all his bluffs that he's going to be betting on the river are always going to fold to a raise. The value hands are going to sometimes call, sometimes fold, depending on what blockers they have and if you think we are bluffing or not. So generally using the weak pairs, the ones that are only bluff catching, right? The ones that don't beat any value, not really like, and like Jack 9 is not really raising because if we can still beat value, so we're just calling that. But weaker hands like 5 make for pretty decent bluff raises. So let's say we do get to the river with a hand like 5-4, right? We're just bluff catching. We're not really beating any value hands that he's betting. So we have the option, okay, do we fold because we don't think he's bluffing enough in the spot? Do we call because we think he's bluffing, or do we raise? And then which hands do we use? And having a 5 makes for a pretty decent blocker because we represent a hand that we could have, something like King 5 or Jack 5 that we'd also raise for value, or pocket 5s if we did see that on the flop. That we're always going to have. And then we also block hands that he could have, right? Like King 5, Jack 5, maybe 10-5 suited if he's a bit looser pre-flop, maybe pocket 5s with a spade that he called on the flop. So having a 5 is a um, pretty decent card to have because we do block value, but we also never really gonna block bluffs, right? He's not gonna bluff with a 5 himself. So having a 5 is a pretty decent card. And if you look at 5-4 here specifically, we can see that 5-4, especially with the clubs or with hearts, is pretty good because those hands do not really block bluffs, right? 4 doesn't really block bluffs, while 4 of spade does block some bluffs. So here we can say we mix this between a call and a raise, and makes for a decent choice. Same here with like 6-5, right? 6-5 with the 6 of spades, not so good because we block some bluffs. We block value, but we also block some bluffs. So we'd rather take the 6-5 of clubs that only blocks value and doesn't really block bluffs because he never really gets there with the 6 of clubs. Okay, so yeah, weak pairs make for pretty decent bluffs, bluff raises, and then um, maybe a quick word to how thin you can see, like even King 6, even King 7, King 8 is value raising here. This depends a bit on our opponent, but if we know that he's value betting Ace Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 9, and we don't think he's protecting his block bet range with enough King Queens, with enough King Jacks, with enough King 4, King 3s, we can just, if we think he's never really stronger than King 4, we can just raise all of our King 8 and King 7s here for thin value for the small sizing and try and just get a bit more value from a Jack. Because if we would check to us, we would definitely value bet those top pair hands. And now we have something a bit more interesting. You also see that there's hands raising such as the 7-6 or the Ace 3, the Ace 4 that are a bit more unintuitive, I guess, and hands that can easily be missed if you haven't really studied these spots. And they're quite interesting. So let's click on a hand like 9-6 here, and we can see that those hands are bluff raising, which may look pretty weird, right? Because we don't really have any good blockers and basically have nothing, right? But solver still likes to raise this, and here it's just about unblocking his missed draws, right? Um, when we have diamonds and clubs in our hand, he's not really bluffing those hands. On the river, I guess we do also block the queen 9, which is some value hands. And yeah, here with these hands, we're just trying to make his bluffs fold. If he was bluffing with an ace high flush draw, if he was bluffing with queen 4 of hearts or something, we get that to fold. We are already happy. So that's why you can see that against this block bet sizing, we're going to see it in other runouts as well. You are going to use some random air hands that unblock the missed bluffs from out of position as bluff raises to just get his missed bluffs, or his missed draws on the flop to fold, and maybe also sometimes get like one weak value hand to fold. Okay. Anything else that's interesting about this board? Yeah, just keeping in mind that this spot is maybe, you know, how many Mr. Ross does he have? Does he get to bluff everything? Right here, a spot where he maybe gets to bluff a lot, right? If he again switch this to the five of the flush draw getting there, the five of spades, then probably this is not a good bluff spot to bluff raise random hands here, because now it's hard for him to find enough bluffs. That's to say, or like here in comparison, we have a board where we can see a spot where it might be over bluffed. We see a small c-bet here in the flop, you know, different sizes might be used here, check on the turn, and then the ace coming in on the river, which, you know, just intuitively speaking, makes sense to be a good card for the imposition player, right? Because we're gonna be c-betting some flush draws on the flop, some ace five, some ace three, maybe ace king, ace queen, that can c-bet on the flop, that we're definitely gonna be checking back, or sometimes checking back on the turn. And then we're all gonna make a top pair with those hands on the river. So this is a spot where out of position is not really allowed to bluff everything, right? And this is really important to pay attention to details like this, because here it's pretty easy for him to over bluff, because when he has to give up with 7 high, with 6 high, with 10 high. Just think about players in your game. Do you ever see somebody showing down, like, you know, decent regular showing down 7 high, 6 highs? They make for pretty natural, you know, if they don't raise on the flop, they will call and they will pretty much always bluff them on the river. So this is now a decent spot to um, bluff catch or bluff raise, because it's easy for him to over bluff, right? All of his king highs basically have to check that get to the river, and only half of his non-made hands, less than half of his non-made hands, are allowed to bluff this river, because it's just such a favorable river. We also then want to think about, okay, what is his value betting range here? But probably top pairs, ace highs, of course, that he gets there on the river. Some of his 9x can still bet for value. Some of his stronger 9x hands. Um, and yeah, also interesting to see here, right? Like the strong parts of his range. Guess that's a different topic, but yeah, that they're checking just because they didn't want to check raise. Um, but yeah, facing the small bet here, we can again go to the button point of view. Now that we know he's betting a 9, he's betting an ace high, which hands do we want to bluff catch and which not? So whenever we have a 9 now, we know that we just have a slam down call. We just beat value. We're just too high up our range. So we're not really folding this hand. Ever, we're also not using it as raises. And then our third pair, low pair, king high, no mid hands. Those are the hands that then bluff catch or maybe sometimes bluff raise. Okay, so for bluff catching, we know that having a king is pretty good because he's not bluffing with a king. So having king 8, king 4, king those are pretty nice hands to be bluff catching, because he's not bluff raising those hands. And we also obviously unblocked then his misdraws, because we have a pair in our hand. That's generally better. And then same here goes with the 8x hands that are pretty high up in our range, so that we do want to call. He's not really bluffing those. But we can see here with 10-8, right? We don't want to have the spade in our hand, because he's bluffing some of this missed flush draws that he's gonna have. But if we don't have the missed flush draw, we do call with a hand like 10-8. Okay. Kind of similar stories here, right? With like pocket fives, pocket sixes, pocket sevens. When we don't have the spade in our hand, we have a pretty decent bluff catches, because we don't block his misdraws. Again, we are seeing bluff raises, not so much on this board, but certainly some when we have, you know, kind of decent blockers, as we can see here with the queen deuce. We could have a hand like ace deuce that maybe you know, bets the flop, checks back the turn, now makes two pair, that now wants to value raise. Having the deuce is good because we're not gonna block any bluffs. He's not bluffing with a deuce on the river. Not having the queen of spades, obviously, because we don't want to block the flush draws. But having the queen of diamonds or clubs is a pretty good hand. So we can see that this hand, and the same goes for the king deuce, is used pretty often as a bluff raise, similar with something like the Queen 4 or the Jack 4, just hands that are now only purely bluff catching, but they have pretty good blockers, so we can use them as a bluff raise. Okay, so this would be a spot that's probably over bluffed. So try to get to the spots where you think that people are over bluffing. It's just when they get to river, right? If you're using a solver, when they have to give up some of their bluffs, and people are like, generally you have to give up some of your bluffs if the run out is not so favorable for you, right? The ace hits the in position player pretty well, so out of position has to give up with some of the bluffs because they don't have so many value hands now that the ace comes in the river. Now obviously this is a complete different story if you put the 5 of spades here in the river, where all of his draws get there. He's really hard now to bluff, so he can bluff every nomad hand. Most of his king high hands, except like the king jack of hearts, right? And even some of his ace high hands that he did call on a flop, right? Even something like ace jack, ace 10, those hands get to bluff on the river after this run out. So pay attention to the small details before you decide to bluff catch or before you decide to bluff raise, because once you know that the spot is over bluffed or under bluffed, you have a hand that's like indifferent here. It's way easier to determine, oh, do I want to bluff catch, do I want to bluff raise, or not? Okay. And when, of course, you don't have any reads on your opponents. Okay, let's look just yeah, there's obviously a tons of spots with different sizes that could come up, with different runouts that could come up, but I think they're a bit too much to cover. I just quickly also wanted to look at what if we face a bigger sizing on the river, because in some runouts like this one, the small size doesn't really make sense from out of position, right? Like here, we see it's small, probably with our range on a good ace-high board, check back the turn, get to this river. And out of position just doesn't really want to be using a small sizing, because if they want to bet, a king is good enough to bet for larger sizing as well. Obviously, same goes for the ace. So a block bet sizing doesn't make too much sense. And the principles always stay the same when we bluff catch or bluff raise on the river. Just that against the bigger sizing, we obviously have to fold a bit more and we raise a bit less. So when we see here, every nomad hand is bluffing. So again, maybe not the best spot to be bluff catching. Even some low pairs can bluff, right? So that's something, but we can still look at the principles, which hands would make sense to be bluffing or not. We can see all his missed flush draws are bluffing, except the Jack 9 and the Jack 8 here. So when we go to bluff catching here, we obviously don't want to have a spade in our hand. I guess that's pretty obvious. The 8s, the 9s, the 7s. When we have a spade in our hand, we fold, and without, we have a decent bluff catcher in theory. Again, a king would never be folding because we beat some of his value bets that he could be having. And then, the queen X are kind of indifferent here. Again, we don't want to have the spade in our hand. We also don't really want to have the heart in our hand. Blocks maybe some backdoor hands that he could have with the, let's say 7-6 of hearts that he could be floating in the flop. You'd rather have this Queen 7 of clubs that doesn't really block any bluffs. Okay. And for bluff raising, this spot is a bit polarizing, because now we really only have like Jack 10 or Queens. But I guess we can still see the principles, right? Like we raise Queens that we could check back on the turn, and then bet now on river, or like Jack 10 that we didn't barrel on the turn. So those are our main raises. And then if we look at what do we want to bluff raise, well, a hand like Jack 5 makes a lot of sense, blocking Ace 5, blocking pocket 5s, not blocking any bluffs, and having a Jack in our hand, wrapping the Jack 10 that we could get there on the river. And then also some bluff raises from hands like, right, against this sizing, less now than against the block bet sizing, right? Because now we face 60% bet sizing, but we can still see the same principles with hands like Jack 7 of diamond, Jack 7 of clubs that unblock his missed draws that he could be having, his flush draws, right? And if we get the hand like 10-8 of spades to fold, then we already accomplished a lot. And we're obviously not doing this with spades or with hearts, because we do block his missed draws. And those hands, would go for the smaller sizing, because with these hands we maybe rep like a top pair or trips that we check behind that now want to raise. And then when we have good blockers such as the queen 5 or the jack 5, blocking two pair, blocking a straight, we go for larger sizing, repping the more polar part of our range. But I think a bit of a better example would be this one, where we can see there's some small bets here as well, for out of position, right? There's some second pair like the jack 10, pocket 9s, pocket 8s that maybe want to go for block bet sizing, but a lot of his range, if he's a queen, board ran out somewhat bricky, so he can go for larger sizing with his queen X, and I think people also would pick that sizing in game. Again, a spot where it's maybe not the best one to be bluff catching, because he can bluff every no mate and every king high hand that missed and now gets to this river. Here you can pay attention if you see somebody bluffing with a hand like ace 9, or with a hand like ace jack, then you know that they might be over bluffing. If you see them checking a hand like king jack of spades because they think they have a flush draw and that's a bad blocker, whatever, then these guys might be under bluffing. So I was trying to pay attention to that. So when we face the 60% sizing, now we want to think about, okay, what which hands make for good bluff catches and which hands make for bad bluff catches. So if we have like a bottom pair with an ace high, not really blocking bluffs again, right? We can see that these hands, ace 3 of diamonds, ace 3 of hearts, makes for pretty decent bluff catch. Ace 3 of spades, more the better, because he can bluff some of his ace high miss bluffs, and then diamonds not blocking anything, either calling or even bluff raising, because we have the nice blockers that we unblock bluffs. Same goes for like hand like 5-4 here, right? Preferably not having the heart. The heart blocks maybe some ace 4 of hearts that he could have called on the flop, while when we have diamonds or clubs, we have a bit of a better bluff raise. Okay. And then again, kind of thinking, again, when you face the bigger sizing, we often tend to use a bit more like of a larger sizing ourselves, because we don't raise thin for value with just any top pair now. If we raise now on the river, our hands are mainly going to be over pairs, two pairs that we check behind, maybe some of our strongest top pairs like ace queen, king queen. But yeah, we generally use a bit of a larger sizing because we rep a bit of more of a polar range when we face a larger sizing on the river. Okay, so maybe to kind of sum up what we learned in this video, when you get to the river and we face a bet, we want to think first about what's his worst value bet hands. This helps us to find our automatic calls. We want to think about his most obvious bluffs to decide which are hands that we are definitely going to fold and that we're never going to consider doing anything with. And then we want to think, before we think about calling or raising, we want to think, is this a good spot to bluff catch? Is he going to have a lot of missed draws? Is he maybe over bluffing, under bluffing? And then if we know this is a good spot to bluff catch, we can also think about, okay, this might also be a good spot to be bluff raising. We raise more if overcards come in on the river. We raise more if draws complete that we can, credibly represent. And the smaller the sizing, the more we obviously raise. For the sizing that we're going to be using on the river, if we raise a kind of weakish merged range of mainly top pairs, maybe some weak two pairs, we use maybe around 50-60% sizing. And if the draws complete, we rep a straight, we rep a flush, we use a bigger sizing of pot or slight overbet. And also, if we face a larger bet on river, we automatically going to use a more polar raising range of two pair plus. Then we're also going to use a larger raise size. For blockers, we want to obviously block completed draws, but more importantly, and maybe not so obvious, we want to unblock bluffs, and therefore often just use some air hands that both unblock front door and backdoor flush draws. And we also want to use weak pairs as both bluff catches and bluff raises because they will never block bluffs. And yeah, only use them if they are only bluff catching, if they're not value beating any hands that you could potentially value bet. Now, maybe you want to think about. Lastly, I wanted to give some tips about, okay, what if you are out of position facing this in position raises? How could you determine if this maybe is an under or over bluffed spot? Very often, or maybe a bit counterintuitive as well, is when the draw completes and people raise, this might often be a spot where it's quite easy to overbluff, right? Let's say here we bring in the 9 of spades, and when you face this, you maybe go for block bet with the top pair hand out of position or second pair hand, and you face a raise here, it's quite easy for in position to turn a hand like 10-9 with a spade into a bluff, to turn a hand like 9-7, saying we block the straight into a bluff. It's maybe easy to bluff raise a hand like ace jack, having the spade blocker. It's maybe easy to bluff raise a hand like a7 with a spade, bluffing the straight um, and the flush, which you can see it's always doing sometimes, but not too often, right? Because those hands would very often just barrel themselves on the turn, and we're just really using our very, very best hands. Like you can see, a6 that also doesn't block bluffs, because now um, we have the good blockers in our hand, not just random a7 that also blocks bluffs. So yeah, when draws completes, people might overbluff with pair plus blocker hands and go overboard with the frequency. And on boards that run out quite bricky, it might be hard for them to find normal bluff raises. But if you go back to this first board here, do people really find a bluff raise here with the hand like, like the random check back like the 9-7 or some the 9-6, the 9-7 here? Do they really find a bluff raise with random like ace high hands that have good unblockers with ace-3, the ace of diamonds or clubs? Probably not, right? So these spots are more likely to be underbluffed. Okay, I think that was it. I mean, maybe against overbets, right? Against overbets, I didn't really wanted to mention them because they are very often pretty straightforward. We don't really have many raises. We're just more about bluff catching, and then we really just want to have um, good, just the best blockers to both bluff catch and then to both bluff raise, right? We don't need to find many bluff raises. We can fold a lot. People are not using this line and very often as an overbet anyway. So, being a bit more of the cautious side is this definitely the right choice there. But if you want, like, we can maybe, um, discuss some spots in the Discord or make another video about this. I'll also leave the drill here that I've made, just a small one maybe in this description, just where it goes c-bet on the flop, check, check, turn, and then you can train this yourself, just pick whatever sizing you want to study, and definitely quite helpful to just get familiar with different kind of runouts, get to know what kind of thresholds are, which hands are value beaters, which hands are just bluff catches on certain runouts, and which hands make for good bluff catches, especially against the small sizing. I think it's often surprising how much we have to call, how much we have to bluff raise. So definitely a lot to learn. But yeah, if there's any questions remaining, if there's something wasn't clear, let me know in the comments, and I will try to answer them. I hope this was helpful, and yeah, good luck at the tables, and see you next time, guys.